So, Lone Rider here, and I want to talk about lessons from Watchung. You don't spend nearly 3 years working on something and hopefully not come away with a little bit of knowledge. And although we ultimately didn't get the mountain bike access the government had repeatedly promised for the course of 3 years, I'd like to think that the entire thing wasn't wasted. Certainly we got more information out there than had been known before. Certainly we all learned a little bit, I think. And to paraphrase the late great singer-songwriter Jim Croce, learned a lot of lessons, and they were not the nice kind. But so that things may not go to waste, I figure I'll talk here about some of them. And in particular, in this instance, I want to talk about exactly that, the getting the information out there that I previously mentioned just now. One of the things I overheard at one of the public meetings we went to was particularly telling, and probably I should have picked up on it at the time. I didn't really, let me put it this way. I did pick up on it, and I did realize pretty much immediately, without having to think about it, what the problem was with that statement, and that it indicated a lack of understanding of the issue. However, I didn't put two and two together at the time and say to myself, well, going forward, that's going to be a problem. And I'm not sure why I did. Maybe I was being hopeful, maybe I was naive, although since I'd spent nearly 3 years digging into the history of the Union County ban on mountain biking, and you know, what I revealed indicated that the government was not very trustworthy at all. In fact, after having 2 decades to do so, they couldn't get their story straight about what actually happened or didn't happen. I guess it's kind of hard to say at the time I was naive. I mean, I had just, like I said, I had just come off spending several years, you know, wading through I don't even know how to describe it. Lies, obfuscation, and misinformation, I guess. And, you know, in that case, I wouldn't say I was naive, but for whatever reason, I didn't put 2 and 2 together. So here's what happened. We're at this public meeting, and this was after the point where I had filed my initial series of Open Public Record Act requests. I had found out that there was no, by the government's own admission, there was no legal authorization for the ban. It was created in a back room by the unelected. They never bothered to document any of the alleged problems with mountain biking. They kept saying there were all these problems, but when I said, okay, I asked for the source material, like documentation of, you know, trail damage or user conflict or anything like that, they kept saying, well, we don't have anything. But they kept repeating that that stuff had actually happened. And I kept saying, well, where's the documentation of it then? And they actually, they were so desperate to try and provide something, they ended up providing a handful of things about mountain biking that they'd saved for 20 years. But, well, actually, that some guy who worked for the county parks department had saved in his personal file, which, of course, isn't germane to an Open Record Act request. An Open Public Record Act request is for official government documents. So if they don't have anything, they should have just said, we don't have anything. Instead, they're like, we don't have anything, but this guy had some stuff in his personal possession that's been moved over time, over the last 20 years, but this is what's left. And it consisted of stuff that wasn't even related to Watchung, but was sort of about mountain biking. A handful of newspaper articles about mountain biking conflicts at other parks, a trail study done of 3 atypical trails, 2 atypical trails, rather, at another park in another county, that post-dated the decision to ban us by a year. So not only was it not about Watchung, it wasn't about, you know, it wasn't in existence at the time the decision was made to ban us, and a variety of other stuff. The only thing they had about Watchung were there were 3 hand-scribbled complaints that were turned in, I think, at one of the trailside centers, saying that an anonymous person, according to another anonymous person, found an anonymous biker to be annoying. Stuff like that. But, of course, that's not documentation of anything. We don't know who wrote it, when it was written, who the other person was, what actually happened. You know, that's not documentation. Sorry. And, of course, you know, they were making statements to the effect, well, there were serious injuries, and, okay, so then where's all your police reports and stuff, and documentation of that? You held on to this stuff that wasn't even about Watchung, such as the newspaper articles, one of which was about a park in Stamford, Connecticut, and the other ones were about other parks, not Watchung. You held on to this trail study that's about 2 trails in another park, nothing to do with Watchung, and it postdates the decision to ban us by over a year. You held on to all that stuff. So why didn't you hold on to all the stuff about Watchung? Well, they never had it. Now, absence of evidence isn't proof of absence. Maybe what they say was going on, but then you have to look at that in context and say, why would they fail to document something that would make their case? Now, you could try and excuse some of this by saying, well, they weren't going to document things at Watchung because they didn't feel they had to. They were going to make this decision behind closed doors, in secret, without any public knowledge, and they never thought they'd be asked to explain their actions to anyone in the public. So why bother to document it if you're never going to have to show documentation to make your case? Okay, but then that begs two questions. One, why was the decision like this being made in secret without any public knowledge? And two, what about documentation that you wouldn't have to actually go out and gather, but that would simply be created in the normal course of government business, such as a police report if somebody was injured and had to be taken to the hospital or get first aid treatment? This explanation, which was never offered, they just totally ignored the lack of documentation. They never addressed it one way or the other. But what I'm saying here is theoretically you could try and explain it away, but it only raises other questions. It raises questions about the government and its conduct if you try to explain away the lack of documentation in the sense of, well, the government never bothered to document anything because it was going to do this in secret. So it would never have to make the case for its policy. Okay, but then why were they making a decision like this in secret? And then you have, again, there are things that if what the government was saying were true, you wouldn't have to go out and gather the information, like do a trail survey or walk around the park taking photos of alleged trail damage. You actually would create some of this documentation just in the ordinary course of the government doing its business. So the question in that case isn't why you, such as police reports in the event of an accident or first aid being needed or somebody being ticketed for doing harm. The question in that case isn't then why didn't they gather the information? It would be why would they throw it away when they saved all this other stuff that wasn't even about Watchung or documentation thereof. They saved a trail study of 2 trails in another park. They saved all these newspaper things. They saved these anonymous hand-scribbled things on cards, which weren't documentation of anything, although they were supposedly about Watchung. But, most of the stuff in that file isn't about Watchung, and the 3 things that are basically impossible to verify. It's an anonymous person found another anonymous person annoying, according to a 3rd anonymous person. And the handwriting on them, my handwriting is bad. This handwriting, it looks like a 5-year-old wrote it. So those are the only things that are about Watchung, and they're not documentation of anything. And the rest of the stuff in the file wasn't about Watchung. Why would they save all of this stuff that's irrelevant to Watchung and not documentation of anything, and not save, let's say, the police reports proving all the injuries and stuff? And no answer. No answer. So yes, absence of evidence isn't proof of absence. Just because there's no documentation of something doesn't mean it didn't happen. But you have to consider that within the context of the entire issue, which is that the government was trying to make the case that mountain bikes were bad. So why wouldn't they go out and just take a picture? Didn't they have access to Fujifilm? And again, not only why wouldn't they go out and seek to gather evidence of all this supposedly widespread trail damage and user conflict, but why would they throw away stuff that would be created whether they wanted to gather it or not, just in the normal course of government doing its business? Like, again, police reports in the event of an accident and somebody getting medical or first aid treatment, etc. No answer. You have other questions. You have the history of the ban. They have several different timelines for what happened leading up to the creation of the ban in 1995. All of this stuff. In my very first Open Record Act request, the government said, well, we don't have anything to provide you about the passage of an ordinance because no ordinance was passed to ban mountain biking. The freeholders didn't act to ban mountain biking. The act in question would be passing an ordinance. But then they say, but there was this old ordinance that banned mountain biking. Okay, so was it legislatively authorized or not? Was there an ordinance or wasn't there? You can't tell me there's no documentation to provide me because they never passed an ordinance and then claim there's an old ordinance. Okay, then that's the ordinance. Provide the documentation for that. The fact that this old ordinance that they described was never linked in writing specifically to the ban from 1995 until 2014, when I started asking questions, even though the ordinance is from 1983 and the ban is from 1995, so that's the first time they would have intersected. You have statements the government made in its Open Record Act request responses where they said things like, well, there was this old ordinance that banned mountain biking, and we arbitrarily suspended enforcement of it from 93 through 95, and then we just resumed enforcement. But then in a newspaper article, they say they suspended, in the NJ.com article from May of 2016, I think, they said they suspended enforcement from 94 through 95. So was it 93 through 95 or 94 through 95? Or was it, as the same person who said 93 through 95 in the paragraph that was appended to my OPA request, and I'll get back to that in a second, in a later OPA request, I unearthed the mountain biking white paper, which that same person had co-authored in 1995, contemporaneous with the advent of the ban, which was made up in the back room by the unelected without any public input. Which, that's not me saying that. That was what the government said in its Open Record Act response. And the reason they said that is because I kept pressing them. I said, okay, so where's all the documentation? And, well, there is none. This was done in the back room without any public input. Okay. But in the mountain biking white paper, which was written contemporaneous with the creation of the ban, what a white paper is a government essay, essentially, that's written to justify a change in policy. This begs the question, if the mountain biking was banned by an ordinance from 1983, wouldn't the original white paper have been written in 1983, and then this was just a follow-up white paper? There's no white paper from 83 about banning mountain biking. There's nothing from 83 about banning mountain biking, except for the ordinance, and I'll get to that in a second. But in the mountain biking white paper, what they specifically said is, they opened it with the sentence, mountain biking in Watchung has dramatically increased over the last 5 years. Now, this is 1995, so that would put mountain biking back to at least, at a minimum, 1989. Dramatically increasing, at a minimum, going back to 1999. And that's just the period of dramatic increase. Now, this is according to one of the key people who wanted to ban mountain biking, Daniel Bonilla, of the Union County Parks Department, here in Union County, New Jersey. Then, in the mountain biking white paper, he gets even more specific. He says, they considered banning mountain biking in 1993, but they decided not to. Okay, so it wasn't already banned by an ordinance from 1983 then. So what is this thing? The same guy, Daniel Bonilla, wrote a short paragraph that was substituted for the actual documents I was requesting in my Open Record Act response, where he said, again, one, that there was no ordinance passed to ban mountain biking, but then he said there was an old ordinance passed to ban mountain biking. They just arbitrarily suspended enforcement of it, but he didn't provide any documentation about that ordinance, even that's what I was asking for. Then he says there was no documentation there's no documentation of problems at Watchung, but he repeats the assertions that there were problems at Watchung without providing source material for it. But he says enforcement of this old ordinance, which he never specifies which, was suspended from 93 through 95. But the same guy in 95 says that it wasn't banned as of 93. We considered banning it, he says, but decided not to in 1993. And furthermore, he opens the white paper in 95 by saying it's been dramatically increasing over the last 5 years. Clearly, there's no policy in place to curtail it, going back to at least 1989. So two places, one where it's more or less implied, and a second one where he specifically says we considered banning it in 93 and decided not to. If you were considering banning it in 93, it wasn't already banned, hence there was no ban to arbitrarily suspend enforcement of. Whatever time frame you're talking about, 93 through 95 or 94 through 95. So we have three different timelines. He says in his Open Record Act response in 2014 that mountain biking was banned by an old ordinance, which I later found out was from 1983. And then he says it was allowed from 93 through 95. Then I find out that the same guy in 95 actually said, no, it wasn't banned as of 1993, and implies that it wasn't even banned as of 1989. Then, the same government that guy works for, about a year or so later, is said to have stated in an NJ.com article on the subject of the mountain bike ban that actually mountain biking was allowed from 94 through 95, and that the government is, quote, unsure why it was subsequently banned, unquote. Well, wait a minute, this is the very government that banned it. Why would they be unsure? Well, Their rationale was that it was causing problems, but by their own admission, they never had documentation of a single one of those. Maybe they didn't want the news reporter to ask a follow-up question like, what evidence did you have that it was causing a problem? How many accidents were there? What sort of trail damage? I mean, think about it. Which coincides with an earlier article from July of 2014, where in the Star-Ledger, a major New Jersey newspaper at the time, where the county spokesman, Sebastian Delia, actually said, "Oh, I have no idea," when asked why mountain biking was banned. That, interestingly enough, is what got me to start looking into this. And I expected to find something very straightforward, that they had documented problems, that they had passed a law or an ordinance in 1995 and banned mountain biking. Instead, I found out that they couldn't even agree amongst themselves what happened 20 years ago. They've got, 3 or 4 different timelines. On one hand, there was legislative authority, and there was this old ordinance. On the other hand, they didn't pass an ordinance, but they did. And then, of course, I finally found out which ordinance it was. And I said, okay, you say there was no ordinance, but then you say there was an ordinance. Which one is it, and what's the ordinance? It turns out that it's an old ordinance from 1983 that regulates where you can ride your bike. Specifically, it regulates bicycle riding on roads, sidewalks, paths, and says you shouldn't needlessly obstruct car traffic. Nothing about this indicates that it would have anything to do with mountain biking, especially since later, in a follow-up Open Public Record Act request, many of the government people actually claimed amongst themselves in email exchanges that I got as a result of a follow-up OPA request that citing this ordinance to try and justify the ban was confusing the bejeebus out of people who looked at the new signs they had put up banning mountain biking. They had taken the old ones down, which didn't reference any ordinance, and put up new ones that said no biking and had this ordinance number at the bottom. But people read the ordinance and saw that it was about roads, sidewalks, and paths, and not blocking cars, and assumed that it meant they couldn't ride on things like paved paths or sidewalks. Well, okay, you usually can't ride on sidewalks, generally speaking, if you're an adult. Paved paths, it kind of depends. Well, in this case, it was clear that you weren't supposed to. But people were reading this, in other words, and they were taking the ordinance word for word what it meant, and the government itself was saying this is confusing people. So what was their response? Not to admit that they might have been wrong about repurposing this old ordinance, which, again, was never linked in writing to the 95 ban until 2014, even though the ordinance was from 83. They actually said in the emails amongst themselves, we have to post a second sign under the one that says no bikes and references this ordinance, explaining that the ordinance doesn't actually mean what it says, and that even though it doesn't say the word trail anywhere in the ordinance, this is not about sidewalks, roads, and paths and not blocking cars. This is actually about mountain biking and bikes in the trails. So disregard the citation we have in the other ordinance. Take our word for it. It's about not riding your bike on the trails. This became an issue because the ordinance doesn't even contain the word trail. Now, they've been talking occasionally about an old ordinance that bans mountain biking on the trails in the park. The problem is nobody knew what ordinance they were talking about, and when they finally identified the ordinance by name and number in 2014, and I was able to look it up, it doesn't even contain the word trail. And what it does talk about are very different things. Now, as many defenders of the ban did, you could come along and say path means trail and trail means path. Maybe, although they've been referenced on county maps as trails only for years. But then you're left with the question of, why does the government admit in itself, amongst itself, in their email exchanges later, that this is confusing people? And they don't just specifically say it's confusing people who read the ordinance word for word and take it literally. They further say many of these parks actually have no paths, just trails. Well, hold the phone. If they mean the same thing, whence comes that admission, right? And then you have the fact that while equivocating and saying sidewalks and paths mean dirt trails, which of course most of us know they don't, but the point is, if that's what you're going to say, then why misquote the ordinance at all and say it says trails when it doesn't? Why not say sidewalks and paths? And if they really do mean the same thing, people will understand from context that you're talking about dirt trails in the park. Obviously, in other words, saying they mean the same thing can justify misquoting the ordinance, but it also then begs the question, why misquote the ordinance if they really do mean the same thing? And then, of course, you have the government's admission in those emails, which I had to sue to get, by the way, because at that point they were refusing to comply with the Open Record Act request. They said it was exempt due to deliberatory exception, that this was a deliberative matter. I pointed out that, according to them, this was resolved in 1983 by the passage of an ordinance, so it hasn't been deliberative in 40 years, if you buy the government's official line. And, you know, what gives? Explain why it's deliberative. What's still being deliberated? They came back with deliberative exception means it's part of the deliberative process. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, I hope you didn't pay a lawyer money for that, because all you're doing is restating the same thing. I'm asking, what are you deliberating? Why is it still deliberative? You're saying, well, deliberative means it's deliberative. Okay, what are you deliberating? That was their justification of the exception. Well, I told a couple people I knew about this, one of whom knew some lawyers, and they said, you know, that's not a good answer to an exception to an Open Record Act request. They have to, if they're going to refuse to turn something over, they have to explain why and what's still being deliberated. They can't just say, deliberative means deliberative. So I sued them. I don't normally go around doing that sort of thing, but it was quite clear in this case that they get something to hide, and you know. I mean, this is like the Hillary Clinton School of Record Keeping. So it turned out, of course, that not only did they say in their emails that this ordinance they've been saying, you know, since it was identified in 2014, was the ordinance that banned mountain biking, and they had been saying an old ordinance, although they never identified which one, and they were misquoting it going back some years. Turned out that not only did they admit there was a problem with regular people, you know, the man in the street would read this and not know what it meant because it said something different than they were saying it meant. So their response was to post another sign correcting the other one and basically saying, yeah, we cited an ordinance, but don't take it literally. This is what it means. Just take our word for it. There was also something in there where they said they were threatening to confiscate people's bikes if they rode in the park. But the ordinance, they said, justified the ban, whether it did or not, which is a whole other issue, never threatens confiscation. I think there's a small fine, you know, of $20-some or something. And it's not just me saying that. In these emails, somebody from the county parks department was told by a person from the county police that when you're making up the new signs and flyers to warn people not to bike, we cannot threaten to take their bike just for riding in the park. That's misleading. Yet, although they didn't put that on the signs, they did put it on flyers that were sent out to kiosks at county parks willy-nilly, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. So, I mean, no wonder I had to sue to get that information. Here they are being, you know, threatening to confiscate people's property, and the head of the county police department, who presumably would be responsible for authorizing their confiscation, is telling them, no, actually, we can't threaten to do that. And that's even assuming that that ordinance was about mountain biking, which, of course, it isn't. It's like, my God, there's so much obfuscation and dishonesty here. Again, was it legislatively authorized? Was it not legislatively authorized? Was this ordinance about mountain biking and trails in the park, or was it not? Was there a problem with mountain biking, or was there not a widespread problem? Obviously, you know, some people remember that there were a handful of mountain bikers who were jerks. I'm sure there were. There's jerks in every group. The point is, if the problem was so widespread that there was no possibility of a compromise and mountain bikers had to be stricken from the park in perpetuity by a secret backroom meeting, that's how serious this was, then where was the documentation of that? Again, especially since they saved stuff that was irrelevant to Watchung and wasn't documentation of anything, why would they not have saved this stuff? Why would they not have gone out and documented it? And again, you could say, well, they never documented it because they were going to do this in secret. Then why was a decision like this being done in secret? You can try to explain away one or two of these things. You cannot explain away all of them. And even if you do manage to explain away one or two, it's only by raising worse questions about the government's conduct and about its honesty and its integrity and its, you know, how it's conducted itself over the last 20 years. Which brings me to what I overheard at this meeting. A citizen was asking, this was before the government had decided to cancel mountain bike access that they've been promising for some years, and you know, myself and other people started looking into this in 2014, and by 2015, we had had a meeting with the county, and they had promised us definitively that mountain bike access would be allowed, and they just had to figure out how to implement it. They hired a consultant. They designed a new trail plan, all of this stuff. They even changed the consultant's contract specifically, we were told, to pay them extra for the mountain bike part of the trail plan. Of course, then nothing happened for a long time, and then the mountain bike part of the trail plan was ultimately canceled. They never changed the contract back. So presumably, this contractor, CMA Associates, is getting paid for stuff they don't have to do. I don't know. It's Jersey. Figure it out. But, so we're at this meeting at a time period when the government was still supposedly working with us to provide mountain bike access. And somebody, a person who has some questions about the idea of mountain bikes being allowed, asks somebody who works for the Union County government, the Parks Department in particular, a person that we're supposed to be working with, a department that we're supposed to be working with. I remember the email I got from Union County spokesman Sebastian Delia very clearly when I sent him an email thanking him, about agreeing to meet with us, and that first meeting, and said, look forward to working with you going forward. And he said, well, you won't be working with me really. You'll be working with the Union County Parks Department, but contact me if you have any problems with them. Oh, interesting. Okay, so we were supposed to be working with the Union County Parks Department. Presumably that meant we were all on the same page. And, so here a citizen, and I wasn't part of this conversation, but I overheard it. That's the key thing here. I don't think he would have said what he said if he knew that I was listening. But he was talking to this other person. As far as he knew, there were no mountain bikers around. And the citizen asked, well, what's changed since years ago when mountain bikers were banned? And the county parks guy goes, well, nothing's changed. It's just that more people want to do it. It's popular now. Whoa, hold the phone. Everything has changed, okay? Everything has changed. What's changed between 1995 and now, and all the intervening years, is that now people know the truth of the ban. Now people are starting to catch on that there's a lot of hinky questions. The government can't get its story straight. There's contradictions up the yin-yang. On one hand, there was an ordinance passed. On the other hand, there wasn't an ordinance passed. Then the same person says that there was no ordinance, but then he also says the ordinance was suspended, enforcement of it, from 93 through 95. But then the same government's later quoted as saying it was 94 through 95. But again, back in 95, the same guy says, well, we considered banning it in 93, but we decided not to. So, which is it? Either there's legislative authority or there isn't. The official line in this paragraph that they appended to my first Open Record Act response in summer of 2014, which, by the way, you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to write a narrative and substitute that for the documents that are requested. They said, we don't have anything to provide you, but by way of clarification, Daniel Benier of the Parks Department wrote X. No, an Open Public Record Act request is a request for documents, not a narrative, not an explanation. Either you have it, or you don't, or you're not turning it over because of some exception which you have to specifically define and explain. Those are your three options. You don't have an option to substitute a story that some guy wrote for the actual documents. Either you have it, or you don't. But anyway, in this paragraph that he wrote, he said, well, we arbitrarily suspended enforcement of the ordinance. Of course, in 95, the same guy says that there was nothing to suspend because it wasn't banned as of 1993. But then we fast forward to October of, 2016, I think? And there's a meeting at the Trailside Center in October, a few years later, where somebody from the County Parks Department, Ron Zuber, I believe, got up there and said to the mountain bikers, please be patient. We can't just arbitrarily allow biking. We have to go and change an ordinance. Now, what's interesting is that first meeting we had with the county and the Parks Department and a representative of its consultant, CMA Associates, nobody mentioned any law or ordinance or that we were getting ahead of ourselves and we'd have to change legislation before we do this. So even though they had mentioned an old ordinance in an earlier Open Record Act request, I kind of got the feeling that they didn't even believe that crap. Because it never came up. We were actually talking about how to implement mountain biking access. Right? But, more importantly, Here's Ron Zuber of the Parks Department at this October Trailside Center meeting saying, I cannot just arbitrarily stop enforcing an ordinance. But that's what Daniel Benier of the Parks Department said 2 years ago in this paragraph that they tried to substitute for documentation in an Open Record Act response that you did do. The official statement from Daniel Benier of the Parks Department was that the government suspended enforcement in 93 and then resumed it in 95. Of course, again, in 95, he actually says that's not the case because it wasn't banned as of 93. They were considering banning it but decided not to. And in a later NG.com article, they said it was 94 through 95. But nevertheless, you can't ignore, just because there's contradictory statements and one or all of them have to be false, you can't ignore that that's what they said. So this is just another contradictory statement coming in. Here's this guy saying, be patient, we can't arbitrarily ignore an ordinance. But the official line is that's actually what you did in 1993 through 95. Even though, again, there's two other timelines. Now we have a fourth thing. We have somebody from the Parks Department who's saying, we can't do that. Well, talk to Daniel Benier, because he still works for the Parks Department. He's your colleague, and he's saying, in an official response, speaking for the government, that that's exactly what they did do. So, left hand, right hand, like, do you communicate at all? The point is, what's changed since 1995 isn't that just, well, people want to ride their bikes, it's more a popular issue now. No. What's changed is that people know the history of the ban. It's not just that more people want to ride their bikes. Yes, that's, people, I'm a cyclist. I want to be able to ride my bike. But that's not what's changed. People have always wanted to ride their bikes. What's changed is that people now know that the ban has a lot of hinky history, a lot of self-contradictions. Hell, that the government has 20 years and they can't even get their story straight. That they aren't even clear on whether there was legislative authorization for the ban. That the ordinance they say is about mountain biking and trails in the park never actually talks about that, but specifically mentions other things. That the government, by its own admission, says that, the claiming that ordinance justifies mountain biking on the new signs they put up is so confusing to members of the public who are just regular old guys in the street with no axe to grind politically one way or the other, and just reading it at face value. It's so confusing that they feel compelled to put up another sign that the same government, despite being warned not to, by the county's own police department, made an illegal threat to, or not legislatively authorized threat to confiscate people's property. That all of this stuff is now out there. The truth is now out there, to employ an X-Files phrase. And the funny thing about the truth being out there is that if you look for it, you can find it. Right? People talk to other people, things get published, things get sent, the mountain bike group has it, the other mountain bikers have it, people tell the owner of the local bike shop, he tells other bikers, maybe he tells the owners of other bike shops, people get curious and come to a meeting and they end up talking to the mountain bikers afterwards, and maybe they learn a few things, people write things online, etc. Not everybody knew this because, of course, the media fell down on the job. They just mindlessly repeated all the stupid stuff the government was saying, even if it was self-contradictory and, raised more questions than answers. But the point is, although people weren't really getting the true facts and the true story from their local newspaper article, the facts were out there, in part thanks to people like myself and other mountain bikers who bothered to look into this and to look into the history of the ban. And it became very clear that what started out as being about wanting to ride your bike and have mountain bike access very quickly became not about mountain bike access at all, but about the government's conduct. Once we found out the truth of the history of the ban, and that it wasn't just straightforward what everybody thought for years, which is that, they passed a law in 1995 to ban mountain biking, or an ordinance or something. Nope, actually, a bunch of goons got together in a secret backroom meeting said by the power of Grayskull, bikes are banned, and then years later, in 2014, tried to justify that by saying there was this old ordinance, but they still can't get their story straight. And of course, stuff they're only now making up in 2014 isn't going to square with stuff they said at the time. Again, at the time they said an old ordinance, but they never said which one, and they said it referred to and contained words that this ordinance actually doesn't. And again, they never said which one. And then, frankly, a lot of the things they talked about back then don't reference an ordinance at all. You know, certainly there's no reference to that particular ordinance in 1995 when the ban was created. You think that would be the earliest time they'd overlap. Again, supposedly mountain biking was such a widespread problem, but nobody has a single photo of a rut or something, or other trail damage, or a single police report. You know, people are now getting clued into all the discrepancies and all things that are wrong here. So what's changed isn't that, well, people just want to ride their bikes, man. What's changed is that people are finally realizing that there was never any reason for them not to be able to ride their bikes in the first place. And again, this isn't about mountain biking. There's mountain biking good or bad or whatever. This is about the government's policy and how it conducted itself 20 years ago and in the intervening 20 years since. And I think it is compelling and it is very significant that they've had over 2 decades to get their story straight and they still can't manage to do so. Well, of course, because they can't retroactively go back and edit documents that were written 20 years ago and exist only as hard copies. But guess what? That's the problem with lying, folks. You know, if you just tell the truth, you never have to worry about getting your story straight. And I think the whole thing is that they never thought anybody would look into this. You can tell that because at the county's own website, for years, they never had a single mention of mountain biking being banned. Now, after I said something about that in a post I put up online, somebody said, well, they've recently posted this ordinance that they say is about mountain biking from 1983. Yeah, but the problem is, as the government itself admits in those later emails about the signage, anybody reading that ordinance doesn't see a single reference in there to mountain biking or bikes on the trails in the park. You know, if they really were so proud of this and weren't trying to hide anything, why not just have posted under their park rules a very simple mountain biking is not allowed at county parks? Now, they eventually did that when they posted the new signs that didn't say anything about mountain biking. They just said, no bikes allowed, and then quoted that ordinance. They also, around the same time, created these flyers. And the flyers did specifically say mountain biking forbidden. But why did they never have anything about that going back for years? For years, there were signs saying bicycles forbidden on trails at the park, but there was never anything on the county's website. Why? The county has had a website for years. In fact, the history of the park goes back to, you know, the original Watchung stables being built in like the 1930s. You know, the current ones were built much later and at a site that's affiliated with the defunct Nike missile base during the Cold War. But yeah, the original ones were built in like the 1920s or 30s. Okay, but they mention that, but they don't mention the mountain biking that, you know, they claim was allowed only from 93 through 95, or that was dramatically increasing going back to the 1980s, according to the same government, or that you get the picture. At the park, if you go to the park, you'll see signs that say no mountain biking. On their website, not a single thing about it one way or the other. Why not just say mountain biking is forbidden at the park? I don't think they wanted people to know about this or question it. I think they wanted to keep the policy in place, but they didn't want to risk people raising issues with it. It's not just that I think they never thought they'd have to account for their actions 20 years ago or since. I think it's that they were afraid to, right? Now, ultimately, it turns out that they had nothing to fear because, well, to quote a statement I heard once somewhere, liars do not fear the truth if there are enough liars. And, you know, obviously, if, you know, everybody in the government is going to kind of overlook the real issue here, which is the government's own policy and was there even a purpose for it in the first place, and instead try and make the debate about mountain biking and is it good or bad or whatever, then, yeah, then you don't have to worry about people explaining, you know, all the problems with your policy because you're just shifting the focus to something else. You're not even addressing that. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about here. The lesson from Watchung here is that institutional interpretations or opinions of issues matter. If the government tells you, as the spokesman for Union County, New Jersey specifically did to me in an email, you're going to be working with the Parks Department going forward on this, then the attitude of the Parks Department and their understanding of the issue matters. If they're telling citizens, when the citizens are asking them, well, what's changed between then and now? If what they're telling the citizens is, well, nothing's changed, it's just that more people want to ride their bikes. No, what's changed is that people realize that the government for 20 years has been lying to them and obfuscating and can't even get its story straight. That's what's changed. Everything has changed. because the context of this has changed. It's not just about, well, I want to be able to ride my bike now. It's about the government should never have banned mountain biking in the first place, certainly not in the way they did. That was the issue at the heart of this conflict. And the fact that the people that we, according to the government's own statements, by their own spokesman, were supposed to be working with, did not understand that. That should have been a tip-off. Like I said, when I overheard him making his statement, I had said to myself, well, that's very different from what they said to us. I remember way at the first meeting, one of the government guys got up there and flat out confessed when we started trying to explain all our problems with the history of the ban. He got up there and he said, look, let's be clear. What happened years ago was wrong. But then, of course, afterwards he immediately said, but let's not talk about that going forward. Interesting, right? But he did admit what happened years ago was wrong. To us. However, when asked by the public, oh, nothing's changed. Nothing's changed, just more people want to do it. No, everything has changed. People now know the government's policy has questionable legitimacy, if not actual legislative authority, right? We used to think that it was some guy, got the government to pass a law banning mountain biking in 1995, or an ordinance. Now we know it was a bunch of unelected goons in a back room just sticking their hands in the air and saying, by the power of Grayskull, bikes are banned. Now we know that's all it is. That's a hell. What's changed since 1995? Everything has changed because a handful of citizens got involved, and for the first time in 20 years, somebody asked the government, okay, you say this is banned. Why? According to what authority? How? And I can't believe that nobody before me and some of these other cyclists came along, that nobody had ever asked, you say it's banned, why? How? Under what legislative authority? How is it that in 20 years, nobody asked the government, okay, you say I can't do this because it's banned. Well, how's it banned? Did you pass an ordinance? How is it that nobody thought to ask that? Am I the first one to think that maybe the emperor's buck naked on this issue? I find that hard to believe, especially since at the time mountain biking at Watchung was banned back in the 90s. It was one of the premier mountain biking locations in the area, if not the so. Yet for some reason, nobody ever thought to ask the government to explain itself. Again, back to the whole, they can't get their story straight after 20 years. Well, why? Well, because they never bothered to try to. The first time they had any indication that people were really going to start looking into this was 2014. The ban on mountain biking was created in 1995. They were really playing catch-up all along. And, if people had just looked at the issue as what it was, which is about mountain bike access in the sense of mountain biking should never have been banned in the first place, the government's policy is not, legit, that's fine. Instead, people were trying to think the issue was about mountain biking. And the government, towards the end, did a great deal to help foster that. Hard to believe is the same government, a representative of whom admitted to us in a meeting in 2014, 15, something like that what happened years ago, quote, was wrong, unquote. But all of a sudden, towards the end, it became about mountain biking and whether mountain biking was a good idea, not whether the government's policy was ever justified or explained, or ever had any basis, either in fact or in legislative authority. So what's the lesson from Watchung here? We were assigned to work with people, we were told to work with people who very clearly knew what the problems were, some of them anyway, but who as a whole were unwilling to admit that publicly. We were assigned to work with people who as an institution, namely the Union County Parks Department, were either unwilling to admit or unaware of the real nature of the issue we were trying to address and the problem we were trying to solve. Like I said, it started out as people wanting mountain bike access and just trying to find out the origin of the ban so that they could work to oppose it and get it removed. In doing so, we realized that there was no legitimate purpose to the ban, and there was a lot of serious questions about its legitimacy, and how it was enacted. And the fact that the government can't even get its story straight in the 20 years since says a lot, right? But it doesn't say anything about mountain biking. It just says a lot about the government's ban on mountain biking. And that's the thing. Once I started filing the Open Record Act request, and we started to get down to the nitty-gritty of what actually happened, all of a sudden it wasn't about mountain biking anymore. It was about the government's policy. And that the fact that mountain biking should never have been banned in the first place, at least not this way. And the fact that we were working with people, supposedly, to address that problem, who at the same time were unwilling to admit that that was the problem. Who, when asked by other citizens, well, what's changed since 1995? Oh, nothing. Well, yes, everything's changed. Now people understand exactly what you did. In other words, we were asked to work with people who were either unwilling or unable to admit or unaware of what the real issue was. Well, with a better one. They can't. Now, at the time, I immediately kind of connected all the dots in my head and said, well, that's alarming. That guy is basically glossing over the real issue and pretending it doesn't exist. However, I didn't put two and two together at the time and say, well, that should be a warning sign. Maybe this is going to end badly and not the way that they've been promising for the last, nearly 3 years. Like so many things in this, in hindsight, I should have seen it coming. The government was not ready to publicly admit that it had made a mistake. It was not ready to publicly admit that its policy had no basis, either in fact or legislative authority. It was not ready to admit that it couldn't admit that it made a mistake. And, so the lesson from Watchung on this is, you get assigned to work with people, you get told that somebody in the government is going to work with you, or a department in the government is going to work with you to try and address an issue, whether it's just you personally, or whether it's you in conjunction with other citizens, or whether it's you in conjunction with other citizens and an actual lobby group like the Jersey Off-Road Bicycling Association, which represents the interest of mountain bikers. Make sure you pay attention to the attitude and the perspective of those people you're supposed to be working with in the government. Because if they, right from the very beginning, if they're unwilling to publicly admit what the issue is, or they're unaware of it, you're not going to get very much done, and ultimately the thing's going to be a failure.